back. The second talk this morning is given by Sebastian, and he will continue his talk on local limit theorems for random walks on hyperbolic group, part 2.
Thank you. So yesterday I studied several theorems, but the one I want to focus on, the theorem we proved is Lallet, that says the following. You take a hyperbolic group, and you take mu, a measure which is good. Good means finite support, and admissible, you can reach any point of the group by doing the random walk, and aperiodic. The GCD of the return time to the origin is equal to 1 to avoid stupid periodicity problems that are relevant for local limit theorem. And there was also this assumption that the measure was symmetric. And the conclusion was that the local limit theorem holds. That is, you look at the probabilities that xn return at the origin at time n, and it behaves, it's equivalent to some constant that depend on mu, from r of mu to the minus n, divided by n divided by n to the power 3 over 2, where r of mu is called the spectral radius with quotation marks of the random walk. And that's the theorem I would like to, for which I would like to find the proof. And yesterday I started with simpler examples, and I showed you different techniques to try to prove local limit theorems. The first example was random walks on ZD, where we could do the proof using Fourier series. And the tool is really not efficient here because such a discrete group has way too many representations for this technique to be efficient. And then we looked at the free group, and especially for nearest neighbor random walk, there was a trick that we could reduce to random walk on n. And then for general random finite support random walks on the free group, we introduced the green function. The green function was this series. And Lally proved that if you look at the finite range random walk on the free group, taking advantage of the tree structure, you can prove that this is an algebraic function. And from this and complex Tauberian theory applied to the singularity of the function, you can get the behavior of the coefficients. And we would like to play the same game, except that since general hyperbolic groups are not trees on a large scale, there is no hope that this function will be algebraic. And so we will have to devise different tools to prove the theorem. And I also mentioned that there was an assumption I was very unsatisfied with, which was the symmetry assumption, which should not be here. I mean, the theorem is probably true if you remove the assumption, except that we do not know how to prove it without the assumption. There are 2 points in the proof where this shows up, at the beginning of the proof and at the very end of the proof. And I would like to start by the very end of the proof. So what is the end of the proof of the theorem? So the end of the proof is we will work hard, and in the end we will again work with the green function, and we will again try to understand its behavior close to the first singularity, which is this R of mu. And what we will be able to show, and it will take some time, but we will show that the green function behaves like, the derivative of the green function behaves like 1 over square root. Just like what we had in Lally's theorem. Well, when I stated the theorem of Lally, I said that the behavior of the green function was something like square root of r minus z. So for to have this or this, it's the same kind of stuff. So we will get this. And then you say, okay, fine. Then we can do like the end of proof of Lally's theorem, we can use a complex Tauberian theory, and then we are done. Except that we will show this, but only when that is real. We will not be able to obtain estimates in the complex domain. Because, well, for Lally, what he could do is say, my function is analytic, is algebraic. So if you have a control along the real axis and your function is algebraic, it transfers to the complex plane. Here it's not algebraic, so we just have real information. And if you just have real information, you cannot apply complex Tauberian theory. So there is something else called real Tauberian theory that gives you information. If you have some information about the behavior of power series along the real axis, then you can deduce something about the coefficients. What is a typical real Tauberian theory theorem is the following statement. Again, you have infinitely many statements, and one of them is like that. Assume that you have a power series, sum of Qn Zn, and the Qn again are non-negative, and you assume that the radius of convergence of this series is R. So it's maybe 1 over something like that. And then you assume that this series, you know, okay, H. You assume that you know the behavior of this series along the real axis. H, you assume 1. Let's assume this. 1 over square root minus 1 minus z when z tends to R along the real axis. And then the conclusion you would like to have is then Qn is equivalent to the nth coefficient of this power series. But that's not true in general. What is true is that the sum of the coefficients is equivalent to the sum of the coefficients of this, and it's something that grows like square root of n. Yes. That's what you get. You cannot identify single coefficients. And there is a good reason for this. It's not true. I mean, for instance, a series like that, you can enforce this behavior by just having non-zero even coefficients and 0 odd coefficients. That's perfectly possible. And if you look in the complex domain, it would correspond to the fact that your function has a blow-up point here at R, but it would also have a blow-up point as minus R. And really, it's not forbidden by the assumptions here. They just say what happens here. So you cannot do better than this. And in general, also, real Tauberian theory is not as good as complex Tauberian theory, because the proofs are more complicated. For complex Tauberian theory, what you do is you just apply the Cauchy integral formula along a well-chosen contour, and you compute. And here it's much more tricky. The proofs typically involve taking some characteristic function of some interval, say 0, 1/2, and approximating this with suitably chosen polynomials and applying these polynomials to your function h and working with that. So it's really much harder, and the conclusions are weaker. So whenever you can use complex Tauberian theory, go for it and avoid real Tauberian theory, but in some situation like that, we don't have the choice. So the conclusion is that you get this. So if you can show this kind of estimates, you get some conclusion, which is not what you want. You would like to get some estimate for this, but you will get some estimate for a series. So the real Tauberian theorem and the estimate here, you get that what? Sum from 0 to n. Okay, I'm looking at the derivative, so I lose some factor n. Essentially, you have n, Pn, and Sorry, I should put some r to the n here. Most of the time you think r equal to 1, but I wanted to state the theorem in a form that will be applicable here. It's like that. So you get this is equivalent to a constant term, square root of n, say square root of n, where Pn is the probability that Xn is equal to the identity, the thing you want to understand. And from there, you're a little bit stuck. What would be good if you knew, say, that this were a monotone sequence? If Rn and Pn were decreasing, then I claim everything would be okay. And by the way, what we want to prove is that Pn behaves like what? R minus n divided by n to the 3/2. R to the n Pn, it should be something like 1 over square root of n. So if your goal is true, essentially this sequence should be decreasing. So it's not unreasonable to, well, if it were decreasing, then I claim that you can conclude. And how can you do this? It's a classical trick in this. You will take this coefficient and approximate it using a series like that or differences of series like that. It's a very efficient trick that comes up often, so if you don't know it, I will just show it to you. How do you do this? You fix some positive epsilon, and then you will say that this coefficient Rn and Pn, it's smaller than, you will say that this is smaller than the previous terms, but don't take the previous terms where the index k is too close to 0, because that would be a stupid bound. Just take an index which is close enough to n. Say between 1 minus epsilon n and n. And rk times kpk. And of course, I have to take an average. I divide by the number of terms. Okay, so that comes from the fact that this is decreasing. And here you see the difference between two terms like that for which I have an equivalent. So this will be bounded by 1 over epsilon n times the series at time n, which is square root of n, minus the series at times 1 minus epsilon n, which is 1 square root of 1 minus epsilon n. Well, these are equivalent, so you have to wait long enough, and maybe you will lose some factor 1 plus epsilon. If you wait long enough, you will have an estimate like that. And what can you see here? Okay, you can factor out the square root of n. So you get 1 over square root of n, which is good, because that's the kind of behavior you expect. And then you get something that depends on the choice of your epsilon. It's 1 plus epsilon times 1 minus square root of 1 minus epsilon. 1 minus square root of 1 minus epsilon divided by epsilon. Some function of epsilon, and when epsilon goes to 0, you see this is a smooth function, everything behaves well, this converges to some coefficient. And this coefficient will be 1/2 maybe. If it's not 1/2, I got my computation wrong and I don't care. So it means that you get some upper bound for your single coefficients. Rn n times Pn will be bounded by 1/2 of 1 over square root of n, which is the right bound you want to get. And to get on this, I use Rk, kpk for k just slightly below n. And if you use k just slightly above n, you will get a lower bound. And the lower bound will be of the same order of magnitude as the upper bound, because the computation will be the same, and what will show up is the derivative of the square root function at the point 1. So you get the same upper bound. So the same lower bound, it's And so once you have the lower and the upper bound, you have the equivalent and you're happy and the proof is finished. Except that this is only true if you have some a priori assumption that your sequence is decreasing. And it will not always be true. Here I assume that my random walk was aperiodic. If there is a periodicity phenomenon, the estimate here will still be true, and it's the only last step that will not work, because, well, everything will be zero at odd times. So this a priori assumption has to be related to the aperiodicity. It has to show up in some way. And then if you try to do probability theory and so on, and play again with your hyperbolic group, you will, I don't know how to prove this. And then there's a trick. You change completely your point of view. You forget that you're doing probability theory. You forget that you're doing random walks. And you just say, okay, I have symmetry. I have a self-adjoint operator, and I will do spectral theory to get that this is decreasing. So you change words. What I will show is not that this sequence is decreasing. I will show that RnPn is decreasing up to some remainder, up to an exponential term. And if you can prove this, that's enough to get this through and to get the asymptotics. So I just said, change words and go to spectral theory. So I want to reformulate everything in terms of operators and L2 scalar products and so on. So how do you do this? You define an operator which is a Markov operator of your random walk. Let me call it Q. Like that. It acts on functions, so Q will be L2 of your group. And what is QF at the point X? You start from X. You walk for one time, and you look at the average value that your function f takes. A function is if it's invariant under this Markov operator. And then how can you rewrite the probability to return to the origin at time n? It's exactly you start from the origin, you walk n times, and you look at those points that return exactly to the origin at time n. And if you do the scalar product, it extracts exactly the information you want. And now, if the measure is symmetric, so no, we assume that mu is symmetric. So since mu is symmetric, this Q, it's a self-adjoint operator. You have the probability to go on one edge in one direction or the reverse edge in the other direction is the same, and it exactly amounts to the fact that Q is self-adjoint. And self-adjoint operators, they have a very nice spectral theory. And I will cheat a little bit. So when you have a symmetric matrix in finite dimension, you know that you can diagonalize it over an orthonormal basis. The same. Here is the same. Assume for a second that Q is invertible. Then you can think of the action of Q on your space as an action of the group Z. And this diagonalization statement is the fact that the space can be broken into irreducible representations, which are one-dimensional because your group is billion. So in infinite dimension, with enough quotation marks, the same will be true. You can break the space into orthogonal, irreducible, one-dimensional representations on which your Q acts just like the multiplication by some number. And since it's self-adjoint, this number will be a real number, and it will be in the spectrum of your operator. So the space L2 of gamma, you can break it as a direct orthogonal quotation mark sum of one-dimensional invariant subspaces on which Q acts at the multiplication by a scalar. And why did I put quotation marks here? Because if you're in infinite dimensions, so the theory is not as nice as infinite dimension, and it's not a sum, it's an integral. And I don't really want to say what this means precisely, just think of it as a sum. And then how can you, so you have your delta E, and say you have your, this is a direct sum, well, so a direct integral of one-dimensional spaces E lambda. I'm cheating really too much here, okay. Delta E, so it splits, it has components on each of these subspaces. It means that you can break it as a direct sum of function over lambda in the spectrum of Q, of some functions, say f lambda, where f lambda is multiplied by lambda when you iterate Q. And also, it's the direct sum, so the norm of delta E squared, it will be the sum of the norm of the f lambda squared. So now we want to compute the scalar product Qn delta E scalar delta E. I'm sorry, I cannot stay with a sum like that because that's too much cheating, so I will write an integral term, but still is the same. You take this component f lambda, and you iterate it Qn times by, okay, it just multiplies it by lambda to the n. It's gonna come in. Not on the spectral measure, on the spectrum. So the f lambda is multiplied by lambda to the n, so what you get is something like that, and then you have some measure on the space of lambdas. Lambda is in the spectrum of your operator. Okay, and I told you that this R, in general, is quotation marks spectral radius because you don't have operators and so on. But in the symmetric case, it's really this R, it's really the spectral radius of your operator Q. Well, no, R minus 1 is the spectral radius of Q. That's what you really have. So it means that the spectrum of Q, at least it's included in the interval minus R minus 1, R minus 1. Okay, so this, you don't really know what it looks like, but at least, well, it's a scalar product, is something which is non-negative. You have the C of lambda, which is non-negative, and this nu with some positive measure. So here, this integral over the spectrum, it's just the integral for lambda from minus R minus 1 to R minus 1. So that's a pretty explicit expression for the probabilities Pn. And you see, for non-negative lambdas, the sequence lambda to the n, it's a decreasing sequence. And even the sequence Rn lambda to the n, R times lambda is below 1. Rn lambda to the n will be a decreasing sequence. So the part of the spectrum between 0 and r minus 1, it will give you for free something decreasing, which is what you want. And it's bad is the part of the spectrum below 0. Because here, when you look at lambda to the n, you have an alternation between positive and negative, and that's the bad guy, for which you don't see a monotone sequence. And the fact, I just told you that the spectrum is included in some interval. The fact is that the spectrum is not covering the whole interval. The spectrum is included in some smaller interval like that. Sigma of Q is included in a smaller interval, say minus r plus delta, not delta, r plus rho to the minus 1, r minus 1. So on the right here, you don't gain anything, but on the left, slightly better than what you could expect from this. And it's really related to aperiodicity. And let me explain to you why this is true in a simpler case where the work is lazy. The work is lazy. It means that the mu of E, the probability to stay where you are, it's a positive number. And in fact, the general aperiodic case can be reduced to this one. So this one is showing what is going on. So if this holds, I claim that the spectrum is like that. And I will tell you why. If this holds, your operator Q, it's a random walk, but in the random walk, there is a part that stays where you are. And the part that stays where you are is just the identity. So your operator, it will be alpha times the identity plus 1 minus alpha, the weight of the other edges, times another Markov chain operator. And then the spectrum of Q, if you add alpha times the identity to something, you're just adding alpha to all its eigenvalues. So the spectrum of Q, it's exactly alpha plus 1 minus alpha times the spectrum of Q tilde. And so it means that this spectrum of Q, this Q tilde is again a self-adjoint Markov operator because the measure here is still symmetric. So it means this thing will again be a priori something symmetric around 0. And then I'm translating it by something positive. So for this guy, you will get the same of this, you can compute everything. And it turns out that the first singularity on the right is the same. Yes. So this stuff here, it's some interval. Before I had an interval centered at 0. And now you get an interval centered at alpha, but with the same right endpoint. So of course, it does not go as far to the left. Here you have a gap of 2 alphas. So the spectrum of Q is included in this strictly smaller interval. What does that mean for the formula here? For aperiodic random walks, it's the same, yes. And the argument is essentially the same. So the conclusion is that my integral here, I can integrate this measure here, it's supported on a smaller interval. This Pn it's integral from minus r plus rho to the minus 1 to r minus 1 of lambda to the n times this coefficient for about which I don't know anything, this C of lambda, and this measure on which I don't know anything, because they were given to me by this spectral decomposition, which is not something very concrete. And then you can split this into two parts. The part, let me multiply everything by Rn, because I want to see that n is decreasing. And let me put the R inside. I cut this into the part from where the coefficients are non-negative. And where the coefficients are negative. Okay, what happens here? You see you're integrating something positive, and this with n is a decreasing sequence. So this part is decreasing. Well, non-increasing. There is something at 0. And, well, some weight at r-1. And this part, well, this is not decreasing because you have some sign alternations, but it's bounded. The absolute value of the second term is bounded by what? You have r divided by r plus rho to the power n. And this is exponentially small. And so that's it. That's the end of the proof. And here you see we use the symmetry in an important way because we relied on the spectral theory of self-adjoint operators. It's really frustrating because it has nothing to do with random walks. It's just because we were not able to do complex Tobian theory. And this I know how to get rid of, but I will not explain it in this lecture. Okay, so all this was just to say, now we are interested in the green function, and we want to understand the behavior of the green function at its first singularity, which is R. And from this point on, and until the last lecture, that's what we will do. And I think I will change my notations. Because from this point on, this z parameter will always be a real number. So the z, now it will be called R. Okay, can't write. It's R, small r. And the green function, until now, it was only the green function from the identity to itself. But when you do random walks, you go from typically you go from one point to another point. So I will need a whole family of green functions indexed by a starting point and an ending point. So instead of writing g of z, where z is my parameter, and the identity was implicit in this notation, I'm switching to gr of x, y, which is the green function from x to y, and so it's the sum over all passes from x to y of r to the power of the length of the pass times the probability to follow the pass. To follow the pass gamma. So this was, with the new notation, it's gz of e. And then we want to understand this function for x equal y equal e, but in the proof, other points will show up. So this function is expected to be algebraic. In combinatorics, the nicest functions are the algebraic ones. And the next class of functions on which you can say things are functions which satisfies algebraic differential equations. I mean differential equations where you can also take powers and powers. And so if you look at a broader class like that, maybe you have more chances that GR will fit in the class. Except that because of this behavior at infinity that you can go in one direction and come back, you don't expect to have anything exact. So what we will try to do is to find an approximate differential equation satisfied by this function. If we can do this and we understand enough on the differential equation, maybe we will be able to integrate the differential equation close to singularity, and it will give us the behavior of the green function. And that's what we want. So that's the game we will play. And for this, we need to understand the differential of the green function. Surprisingly, there is a very simple formula for the differential of the green function, which is like that. Okay, you take the green function and you multiply it by r, because that's the way it is. And then you differentiate this with respect to r. So x and y are any point in your group. And claim is that you have a formula for this, and it's the sum of the w in your group of the green function from x to w times the green function from w to y. That's a formula. And let me prove it for you. You have two sides. We will compute the two sides and see that they coincide. Okay. You start from the green function here, which is this. You multiply by r. So it adds a 1 in the coefficient of r. And then you differentiate with respect to r. So what you get is rgr of xy differentiated with respect to r. You get sum over gamma from x to y of length of gamma plus 1 times r to the power length of gamma times the probability to follow gamma. That's the explicit expression for the first term here. What about the second term? The second term well, let's write it just using the expression above. Then I have a double sum. I will have a sum over w, and then a triple sum. A sum over w, and then a sum over all passes from x to w, and then a sum over all passes from w to y. And now I have to put r to the power of the length of gamma 1 times r to the power of the length of gamma 2 times the probability to follow gamma 1 times the probability to follow gamma 2. Just stupid rewriting of the formula. But then, when you have one pass from x to some point w, and then one pass from w to y, there is one thing you want to do with this pass. You want to concatenate them. If you concatenate them, you get a pass from x to y. And this pass from x to y, you see here you have r to the power length of gamma 1 plus length of gamma 2. This is the length of gamma. So what you get here is really r to the length of gamma, and the probability to follow gamma 1 and then gamma 2, it's exactly the probability to follow the whole path gamma. So essentially you get the same kind of things as here, except that a path gamma like that can be decomposed in several ways as a concatenation of a path gamma 1 and the path gamma 2. Since we're summing over all points in the group, it means that this path we can truncate it at any place we like, and the decomposition will appear in this sum. And how to truncate? You can truncate at the first position and the last position, and the number of positions is exactly length of gamma plus 1. Multiplicity in the sum is length of gamma plus 1, and the same. Okay, there is something not very nice in this formula, that we have to multiply by r for differentiating to get a nice formula. It's just some inconvenience when you write the formulas, because you have to take care of the powers of r that are everywhere. So if you agree, I would like to cheat. And I would like to lie to you until the end of all the lectures, and I would like to pretend that there is no r in this formula. really it doesn't change anything in the proofs, well, or really it might inconvenience, but for me it will be easier, and for you it will be easier to follow also. So I think we all agree that it's a good idea to do that. So I will pretend from this point on that the derivative is exactly the sum. Okay, now that we have this nice formula, we will find the differential equation. So we want to find a differential equation relating, well, on the function. What we want to understand is the green function from the identity to itself. So we should start from it, start differentiating it, and see, oh, here I spot a relation. That's my differential equation. So let's start doing this. Well, GR of the identity to itself. So maybe I will even compute the second differential of the green function from any x to any y, so that you see what is going on. What is the second differential from x to y? Well, you have to start from the sum here and differentiate it. Okay, differential for products. You know how to do that. At least I think I know. If you differentiate the first term, gr of xw, again, you will introduce an intermediate point between x and w, and you will sum over all these possible intermediate points. So you will get a sum over v of gr of xv, gr of vw, times this one which is not differentiated, gr of wy. That's what you get if you differentiate the first term. And if you differentiate the second term, essentially the same. Maybe I should write it down, because it's gr of xw, and then you have a sum of v of gr of w v, gr of v y. I said it's essentially the same, but in fact it's exactly the same. Because if you extend the role of v and w in the first line and in the second line, it's the same. It's exactly the same stuff. You start from x, you want to go to y, and then you introduce two arbitrary intermediate points, v1 and v2. And then you go to v1, and then you go to v2, and then you go back to y, and you sum over all these possibilities. And the sum appears twice, so you get, for the second derivative, you get twice a sum like that. And with this, you can go on. And you can compute the nth derivative of the green function. Exactly with the same formula. The nth derivative, it will be exactly factorial n times the sum over v1, vn, all possible intermediate points of gr of x to v1, gr of v1 to v2, gr of vn to y. Same proof. And so you can see why I wanted to cheat and to remove the r here. Because if you keep the r, you can still write the formulas, but they are much more messy. So this one is a nice wrong formula. So now we have this. We can start playing with the green function at the identity and try to find our different equation. So the green function, then maybe instead of writing sums, I should make pictures. It's just you start from E and you want to come back. And sum over all paths from E to E. The green function, the derivative of the green function from E to E, it's you start from E, you go to some V1, and then you come back. The second derivative is you start from E, you go to some V1, and then you go to some V2, and then you come back. And so on. Okay, I could go on forever. You don't really see the differential equation right away, because we'll keep adding more points. But what you have to remember is that we want to do geometry, and the geometry here is hyperbolic. Triangles are not like that. What I should have drawn here is rather something like that. You go from E to V1, and then you go from V1 to V2, and then you go back from V2 to the identity. And here, maybe you start seeing the differential equation. Because if you put a point C in the center here, what we're doing, say that the random walk was not random at all, but was just walking along geodesics in a straight, stupid way, you would be going from E to C, and then from C to V1, and then from V1 to C, going from C to V1, and then from V1 to C, and summing over all possible values of V1, it really looks like the first differential. Except that you will have something like that, and something like that. So here in the second derivative, you will see several copies of the third derivative. And that's your differential equation. And that's what you want to make precise. So really, it's a geometric features that shows up here. I will say it with my hands. Here it was just waving hands. I'm just saying that a triangle is a tripod, so it's a union of 3 segments. Yes. And even when you add weight like that, when you add weight, you see you're adding more weight to longer trajectories. So the larger the R, and the more and more inefficient your random walk is. And especially at the spectral radius, your walk is really inefficient, more than logarithmically. And that's something we will have to fight against. Okay, so I will make some assumptions that I will need to justify further on to try to make this argument a little bit precise. So I will assume, first assumption, that the green function is multiplicative along geodesics. And that's something you've already seen in Peter's talk last week. And by this I mean, you take 3 points on a geodesic, and then the green function to go from the first point to the last point is up to a multiplicative constant. It's the same as the product of the green function from the starting point to the middle point of your geodesic, and then the green function from the middle point to the end point of the geodesic. And then, if this is true, here in this formula, GR of EV1, GR of V1, V2, GR of V2E, well, you introduce the center 1, center C of a triangle. It's, maybe I forgot to say, but hyperbolic geometry, the definition, the very definition, is that whenever you take triangles with, there is, not unique, but there is a point C which is within distance, uniformly bounded by some constant delta, with the characteristic of the space, which is within distance delta of all 3 sides. That's one of many equivalent definitions of hyperbolicity. So here I can take this center, and essentially it's on the geodesic, or close to the geodesic from E to V1, V1 to V2, and V2 to E. So we'll use this assumption 1 to split the green function as up to some multiplicative constant as the green function from E to C times C to V1. And then from V1 to V2 we can do the same because C is close to a geodesic between these 2 points, GR from V1 to C, GR from C to V2. And then for the last term I can do the same, GR from V2 to C, GR from C to E. And then I want to group together those terms to to make it clear that I'm going from C to V1 and then back and so on. So this is GR from C to the identity and then times GR from C to V1 and then back. And then GR from C to V2 and then back. Okay. Well, here I'm doing it for the second derivative. I will not need to go further. My differential equation will be of order 2. But you're absolutely right. If there were more terms, I would have a constant C to the power of the number of terms. And once you have this, you know in the second derivative, you have to sum over all V1 and V2. So you sum over all V1 and V2, so it's the sum over triangles like that, and for each triangle you get a center C, and it's in some way inconvenient to have the C that varies with a triangle. So what I will do is that when I have a triangle like that, I will shift everything back and put C as the identity. So I will multiply by C minus, if you will. And then we'll get a sum over what? If you put C at the identity, you have the choice of V1 with respect to C, the choice of CV2, and the choice of CE, which is C minus 1. And essentially, you are summing over all these three possible directions from the point C. So if I bring back C to the identity, I have to sum over three directions. Let me call them W1, W2, and W3. But these are not independent directions. I want E to be the center of the triangle. So just the center of W1, W2 of the triangle with vertices W1, W2, and W3. I want this to be the identity. And you will have, well, here, going from C to V1 and V1 to C, everything is left invariant. It will be the same as going from E to W1 and back to the identity. And the same for W2 and W3. So you have these terms, and then you have the same with W2 and the same with W3. And now it's not a summation over all points, but it's not really different. If you just want an upper bound, you will say, okay, I bound it by the sum over all terms. And in fact, it's not hard to get also a lower bound. Because whenever you take 3 arbitrary points, just by left multiplying by some words of bounded length, you can put them in a generic position so that this is satisfied. So, yes? Sorry?
Your expression have GREW, GRWE.
Yes.
Are you going to reduce it to a square or?
No, because this does not need symmetry. The symmetry is really just at the end of the argument for this argument and at one specific in the proof that I to highlight. Okay, say that here, so you work just a little bit, you realize that you can remove this center stuff. Really, it's mild. So let's forget about this. And if you forget about this, you have a sum over 3 points, well, of 3 times the same thing. So you get a sum of a W of GR of EW, GR of WE. And since you have 3 terms, you have a product, so it's cubed. But this is exactly, you go from E to arbitrary point and you come back. First derivative. Cubed. That's your differential equation. The second derivative is up to some bounded multiplicative constant, cube of the first derivative. And even better. That's a simple differential equation. Even I know how to integrate it. And I'm not really good at differential equations. Well, except that I just said that the ratio is bounded above and below. But if you want to apply covariance theorems or whatever, you don't need some bounded from above and from below. You need a convergence, something. So let's make a second assumption now. Second assumption. We'll assume that we can strengthen this bound from above and from below to some equivalent. That second derivative, when r tends to the spectral radius, it's equivalent to some constant times the third derivative. Well, it's not surprising. You know, in mathematics, whenever you have something bounded, which is not artificial, always it converges, always. Except if you're building for your students the sequence -1 to the power n. When you have natural example, it converges always. I'm not saying it's easy to justify. I'm saying it's the case. So that's what you expect. Maybe we will need to work hard to prove this. We will need to work hard to prove this, but still, it has to be expected. And then, once you have that, I can divide by the cube and realize that it's the derivative of 1 over the square, something like that. If you take the derivative of this, you should get second derivative divided by cube of first derivative, which is what we know. So this converges to some constant. And maybe you have a factor -2 or whatever, so let me change the constant. And then you can integrate this between small r and the spectral radius. You will get that 1 over first derivative squared minus 1 over first derivative squared at the spectral radius. It should behave like, maybe I switch sides, so let me just put a second constant. What is some expression for this? Looks nice. You're almost there, except that you have this guy, and this guy you don't know what to do with it. But okay, you have an analytic function, and it blows up at r. Well, r it's first singularity. Doesn't tell you much. First singularity of an analytic function. The function could be finite, derivative could be finite, the second derivative could be finite, and so on. But most of the time, it tends to be infinite, or maybe not the function, but probably the derivative. That's what you would expect. And if you look at the provisions I made in the statement, you expect this to be infinite. Let me put a third assumption here. That this, as a singularity, this derivative is infinite. Let me just remind you that this first derivative, it's, what is it? It's a sum of n, r, n, p, n, okay? Maybe pn minus 1, no, it's maybe r, n minus 1. Okay, it's essentially like that. And our goal in the end is to see that pn behaves like 1 over n to the 3 over 2. So this should be, if the theorem is true, and that's what we are trying to prove, it should be like 1 over square root of n. And of course, the sum of the 1 over square root of n is infinite. So this should be true. That's what you expect. You will need to prove it before you end the proof of the theorem. So you will not have the full power of this, but maybe you will have enough information at some point to prove this. And that's why I write it like assumption 3. So if you accept these assumptions 1, 2, and 3, then I'm saying that the proof is done. Because once you have this, you have 1 over the derivative squared that behaves like that. Take the inverse, you take the square root, and you get that the derivative behaves like a third constant divided by square root of r minus r, which is what we wanted to have. And from this, you know how to proceed using the symmetry of the measure and spectral theory and so on, and real Tauberian theory. So that's the global strategy of the proof. That's what we want to do, but we have to justify 3 points. Assumption 1, this multiplicativity along geodesics. This point 2, to strengthen the boundedness ratio to some convergence. And this point 3, this a priori estimate that the green function, the derivative is infinite. 3 is much easier than. I have 2 lectures left after this one. Maybe one will be devoted to assumption 1, and the other will be devoted to assumption 2. And maybe I'll try to do assumption 3 right now. And I kept the formula, that's wonderful. Okay, so you want to show that the quantity is infinite, but you don't want to go into too many details. You don't want to rely on asymptotics of Pn. You just want something a little bit rough. So,
of the order of 1 by square root r minus r presumption 1 without
assumption 1 is okay.
You get this without actually working hard for the actual asymptotics. So if you have just bounds, can you say?
No, real Tauberian theory does not work like that. It cannot convert rough bounds into rough bounds on the coefficients, which is sad, but you really need equivalence. Okay, the proof of 3. Well, we'll go by contradiction. Assume that this derivative finite. Then, you see here, I have a formula relating the second derivative to the first derivative, or to the cube first derivative. So in particular, if the first derivative is finite at the spectral radius, and I'm using the assumption 1 to justify this, then if the first derivative is finite, then the second derivative will also be finite. And what about the third derivative? The third derivative, it's a sum over, it's factorial 3. Okay, here it's a power series with non-negative coefficients. So you have an increasing function, and you ask, is the limit finite or infinite? The third derivative is the same, right? The series, it's a series with positive coefficients. And if you prefer, you can do all the computation with r just strictly below big R and ask what is the limit when this tends to big R. The third derivative, you have a sum like that. No, yes, because of the computation here. Yes. The third derivative, you see, you go from the identity to V1, and then from V1 to V2, and then from V2 to V3, and then back to the identity. And you're still in the hyperbolic space, so it has to be tree-like stuff. I don't know, maybe it's something like that. And then to go from V3 to the identity, you have to do something like that. And you see, this, again, and you have to sum over all possible values of V1, V2, and V3. So maybe for different V1, V2, V3, you will get different tree configurations, but you have finitely many tree configurations with 3 points. And for each configuration, say for this one, you can say that going from here like that is the same as going from here to here. Well, maybe I should put some arrows. When I go from E to V1 like that, and then I go back, and then I go like that, and like that, and like that, and like that, and back, and back, and back. So you see, each part, I go once in one direction, once in the other direction. And then I can do the same computation as here, and say that this sum of green function, it's exactly going from here to here and then back, 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 from here to here and then back. All this stuff, when I sum over values of everything, all these stuff, they are controlled by, again, the first derivative. So if you know that the first derivative is finite, you will deduce that all the sums over all these possible trees and configurations and so on, it's finite. It's factorial 3 times something finite. And in the same way, the nth derivative, okay, the combinatorics become a little bit more involved. Maybe you need to argue by induction or be careful. But you will get factorial n times something finite. And why do I want to separate the n factorial and the something finite? Because the something finite, you can control it. You can control how many times you will need to split the stuff, how many times you will need to apply Yankaunen inequality, how many times you will, how many powers of GR prime will appear here. And everything will just be linear numbers of times in n. So if you need to be careful, but in the end, what you get is that this finite is bounded by a constant to the power n. So you see, you have this function at big R. You control the successive derivatives, and if you divide by factorial n, they grow at most exponentially. Yes. Well, the C will be a constant that you get from here times the value of the first derivative, which I'm assuming is finite. And you can still fit it in that. It's messy to try to write down all the computations of all the configurations of tree and do it like that. It's more efficient to do it by induction, say. If you have a bound at the n minus step, well, at all steps before the n minus ones, you can get a control at the n step. So it means, once you have this, it means that the series sum of GR to the n of E divided by factorial n times h to the n, this converges for enough h. Which means, and this will coincide with the green function. So it means that you have found an analytic extension of the green function slightly to the right. And Jean-François, same. So what you can do is, instead of doing it precisely as a spectral radius, you don't know really what's going on, just take a point slightly to the left, R0. And at R0, you will have exactly the same bounds. So you will say that the series of your green function R0, it's converging on a disk of radius essentially 1 over C, where C is this constant here that does not depend on R0. So it means that R0 is close enough to R, you get an analytic extension of your green function to this smaller disk. But that's a contradiction, since you have a power series with non-negative coefficients, and then it's known that it has a singularity at R. It cannot be extended analytically beyond this point. So that's a contradiction. And that's the end of the proof of 3. We know that this green function here is infinite. And by the way, this simple argument, not from our paper with Lallet, we had a much more complicated argument that relied on tools that I will explain to you for step 2. And it was developed by my student Mathieu Dussault in the setting of relatively hyperbolic groups, and I like this proof very much. Okay, so that's the end. Okay. No, I still have 5 minutes. What can I do in 5 minutes? Maybe I will talk to you a little bit about this assumption 1. What does it mean to be multiplicative along geodesics? And that's something I will develop more tomorrow. Unless you have questions on what I have explained until now. Okay, so what is this multiplicativity? So it all started with a theorem proved Ancona. I think in '86. And he proved the following. Well, he proved something more general than this. He proved you take gamma hyperbolic group, and you take a good measure mu, and you take some parameter r, which is strictly smaller than the spectral radius. And what it's telling you is that there exists some constant c, such that for all way x, y, z on a geodesic, in this order, so you have x, y, z here. And then he wants to understand the green function from x to z. So if r were equal to 1, it would really have some probabilistic interpretation. It would be the expected number of times that you spend at z if you start from x. But even if r is not equal to 1, that's the intuition you have to keep in mind. It's a probability, a skewed probability. You can interpret this precisely in terms of branching random walks, where the number of you can interpret this in terms of branching random walks, where you have a number of offsprings at each step, which is equal to r. So you can really think of this as some probability, in an external sense, to go from x to z. And of course, if you know how to go from x to y and then from y to z, you concatenate this path and you will get a path from x to z. So this probability, it's at least the probability to go from x to y times the probability to go from y to z. And you have to pay some constant here. But it's not important. So this is always true in whatever group for random walk. What is not obvious is that maybe you have many trajectories that go from x to z and that avoid completely the point y. And then in this case, this one would be much smaller than this one. And what Ancona tells you is that in hyperbolic groups, it's almost a tree. So maybe trajectories will go away, but most of them will go close to y. And which means that you should have an upper bound of the same order. And that's what Ancona proved. And maybe just to finish, so this is a kind of property we will need to play our game. Except that, well, two things. First, when your group is a tree, this inequality and your random walk has finite range, this inequality is obvious because the ball has, the walk has to go through a ball of fixed radius around y if it wants to go. And once you're in this ball, there is a bounded from below probability that you reach y. So this is obvious in trees, and this is not obvious in hyperbolic groups because you can take a long passage that will avoid the point. And so what this says is that, okay, you have passages that avoid the point, but they're very unlikely, and you forget about that, and you just want to put expectations. And this is really different, say, from or from Z cubed. In Z cubed, what is the probability, the green function in Z3? I take Z3 because I want walk to be transient. The green function from x to y is something like 1 over 1 minus x to some exponent that I will not get right. Say 1/2. D minus 2 over 2, something like that. So 1. No, 1/2. Okay, so what does it mean? That look at these 3 points, 0, n, and 2n. Then the green function from here to here, it's roughly 1 over square root of n. Up to a multiplicative constant. The green function from here to here, it's also 1 over square root of n. And the green function from here to here, it's what? Well, apply your formula. It's 1 over square root of 2n. If you compare this with the product of these two guys, the product is 1 over n. The product is much smaller than this 1 over square root of 2n. And the reason, there are many ways to go from 0 to 2n. In Z3, you can go like that. You can go like that. And the length of this path or this path, they're roughly the same. So it's not much more likely to take this one than this one. And that's why the contribution of the direct path is not dominant. In hyperbolic groups, passes that do not follow geodesics tend to be much longer than the direct path. And that's why they will be negligible. And that's why Ancona inequalities have a chance to be true. And I will tell you more tomorrow. Thank you.
So any questions or comments? No? Not that, okay.
Ancona says whatever R is strictly smaller than the spectral radius, you're fine. But here we will need to go up to the spectral radius, and that will be one important problem for us. More on this tomorrow. Yes.
Questions? Comments? No, let's thank Sebastian again for his nice talk.